Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are looking into something a little different. We are looking into a major world religion. And the reason we are looking into this religion today is because it's one that most famously has many misconceptions about it. I am, of course, talking about Wicca. And right off the bat, you're probably instantly thinking witches and covens and pentagrams and devil worship and that 1995 film The Craft, which is still an excellent film, by the way. I was like 11 when that film came out, and it's probably one of the reasons why Fairuza Balk has always been one of my celebrity crushes. But I digress. But overall, that is the classic image we get when we hear the word Wicca. But those are all misconceptions. Wicca is actually nothing like that. The popular imagery we get from films and television is way off. But we have to ask, when we strip away all those misconceptions, what really is Wicca? And to be perfectly blunt, there is no perfect set answer to that. That's like going up to some Christian and asking, what is Christianity? With all religions, you get various different answers. But in this episode, we're going to do what we always do, and we're going to start at the beginning. And as a quick disclaimer, I'm not going to touch on every aspect of this religion. That's impossible to do in this episode. And since I'm not a practicing member of this religion, some of my information might be a little inaccurate. So if I get something wrong, feel free to let me know. I am really just going off of the research that's available to me. So without further ado, let's start with Wicca. Now, a lot of people might think that Wicca is an ancient religion. A lot of people think it might go way back into the ether and have origins amongst the earliest shamanistic rituals of man. But that is another major misconception. Wicca is a largely modern religion. It pops up around the 1930s. And to be honest, it all starts with a man named Gerald Gardner. Anybody who studied this religion knows that name. But for those who don't, this man was critical in laying those early foundations of this religion. And not only did he lay these initial foundations, he gave this religion to the masses. So to truly understand the foundation of this religion, we have to understand Gerald Gardner. Now, he was born in 1884, and he came from this wealthy upper middle class family that made their fortune in timber. And he spends the early part of his childhood in Lancashire, mostly in the company of his Irish nursemaid. He was like the third child, and his parents were usually largely busy and absent from his life, so he had to learn from an early age to do stuff on his own. Now, as a child, he suffered from asthma, and on the advice of his nursemaid, his parents sent him to live in warmer climates. So in 1888, they traveled to the south of France. They spent several years in the Mediterranean. In 1891, they traveled to the Canary Islands and the Gold Coast and the island of Madeira. And they spend 9 years on the island of Madeira, only really returning to England for those summer months. But with traveling around to these warmer climates, he never had any formal schooling. And while his Irish nursemaid was basically his surrogate parent during these years, she mostly left him to his own devices. A lot of people say she was more interested in carousing with the local men than taking care of young Gerald. However, this gave him an opportunity to really flourish because he would become interested in the local cultures. He became interested in things like weapons and esoteric things, and he literally taught himself how to read and write. And through this, he became a voracious reader. And through this voracious reading in his youth, he comes across a book called There Is No Death by Florence Marat. And this book was a discussion on spiritualism, to which he took a keen interest. And this was a time in the 1890s where spiritualism had started to taper off a little bit in the mainstream, but there were a lot of people in like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, for example, who were still kindling an interest in it. And of course, 20 years later, we would get that huge resurgence during that second wave during World War I, but we're jumping ahead. But the gist is, this particular book seemed to have been a huge interest to young Gerald. So that takes us to about the year 1900, where his nursemaid, she married a man named David Elkington. And he owned a tea plantation in the British colony of Ceylon, now modern-day Sri Lanka. And naturally, with an agreement with the Gardners, they take young Gerald along to live with them in order to teach him the tea trade, because, hell, it's the British Empire, and the British Empire ran on tea. So it was an extremely lucrative career path in 1900. So he begins learning the ins and outs of the tea trade, and while he stated he hated the dreariness, endless work, he did love being out in nature with the forests and the deer and all that fun stuff. Eventually, by 1904, he's a little older and he moves into his own bungalow and he takes another position on another tea estate, and he's doing that for his living. And in his spare time, he was taking a great interest associating with the Sinhalese natives, and he took an even greater interest in their Buddhist practices and beliefs. And this was actually a common thing that was happening across the whole of the British Empire at the time, especially with this generation who were born around the 1880s. They were taking great interest in these Eastern, mostly Buddhist religions. Now, in December of this same year, 1904, his parents and his younger brother visited, and they basically asked him if he wants to run this rubber plantation that they have set up in Sri Lanka. This allows him a great deal of leisure time. He ends up joining the local militia, and it really gives him a lot of time to learn more about these Buddhist beliefs and practices, as well as other beliefs and practices amongst a lot of, for lack of a better term, tribal people. And he took a deep interest in things like tribal magic and all that really esoteric stuff. In 1907, he returns to Britain for several months, and he becomes friendly with this other family called the Surgensons. And the Surgensons really love to talk to him about these paranormal topics. For example, the family patriarch, a man named Ted, he truly believed that there were fairies that were living in his garden. He would state that he could feel their energy and that he knew that they were there. However, it was also through the Surgensons where he found out some family rumors and myths about his own family. They stated that Gerald's grandfather, a man named Joseph, was a practicing witch after being converted to it by his mistress. And there was another unconfirmed family belief that Gardner would go on to repeat, that he had a Scottish ancestor by the name of Gerald Gardner, and he had been burned as a witch in Newburgh in 1610. So already by 1907, Gardner, he's being introduced to the world of witchcraft. So he returns to Ceylon in 1907, and he goes back to running this rubber plantation, and while living at this plantation, he becomes a Freemason. And I know it's been requested at least 500 times. I swear I probably have 500 emails sitting in my inbox about this, but I will one day do an episode on Freemasonry. So in 1910, he was initiated as an apprentice Freemason into the Sphinx Lodge number 107 in Colombo, which is like the capital of Sri Lanka. And initially, he takes this very seriously. After the first month, he's already obtained the second and third degrees of Freemasonry. However, after about a year, his interest in Freemasonry starts to wane, probably just because it doesn't really have that true esotericism he's looking for. While Freemasonry does have a little bit of that esoteric stuff, it's more like a fraternity and not really a religion. And it looks like Gardner was always looking for something a little more magical. However, in 1911, some things change in Gardner's life. The rubber plantation isn't doing all that great, and his family sells it to other interests. And Gardner moves to British North Borneo, which is modern-day Malaysia, and gains employment as a rubber planter at another estate. However, he didn't really get on well with his employers, particularly the plantation's manager, a man named R.J. Graham. And one of the big problems with R.J. Graham was he was a complete and total racist. He literally wanted to deforest this entire local area, and in doing so, completely wipe out some of the tribal people of this area, particularly the people of the Dayak and Dunsan kind of tribal groups. And these were people who Gardner had become friendly with and were fascinated by, because Gardner was always kind of an amateur anthropologist. He was fascinated by peoples and their traditions and their local customs and their religions. And he always took a fascination with their weaponry. Weapons seem to have been of particular interest to him throughout his life. Kind of like how I'm fascinated by firearms, probably because I spent half a decade as a firearms salesman, but I digress. And it's in becoming friends with these people, he really took an interest in their religious beliefs, especially these beliefs that dealt with things like healing magic. And he stated that one time with the Dunson people, he attended one of their seances. It's also believed that around this time when he was interacting with these indigenous people was when he acquired his tattoos. He had 2 tattoos on his forearms. One was of a dragon and one was of a snake. And a lot of people believe that he acquired these while he was interacting with these people because they do have a bit of a tattoo culture. However, things didn't really pan out for old Gardner on this new plantation. He couldn't deal with his racist bosses, and apparently the working conditions were just god-awful, so he says screw it and he moves to Singapore. So it's around 1911, he arrives in Malaya, which is basically modern Singapore, Borneo. And he's initially planning to return to Ceylon, but he gets offered another job working on another rubber plantation, which he takes. And he decides to supplement that income with creating his own rubber plantation. He eventually purchases like 600 acres, and he's growing rubber trees on that 600 acres. Now, it was here during his time in Malaya where he's introduced to an American man who had converted to Islam after marrying one of the local girls. And this whole part of Malaysia, and I guess Indonesia, which is like right next door, it's heavily Islamic. And it's through this new friendship with this Cornwall guy where he is subsequently introduced to a lot more locals whom he quickly befriends. And while Gardner never becomes a practicing Muslim, he learns everything he can about it. At one point, his friend Cornwall invites him to make the Shahada, which is the Muslim confession of faith. And by doing this, it allowed him to really gain the trust of the locals. It basically showed that he respected their culture and beliefs, and it kind of opened that door of trust. However, this Cornwall guy, this American friend of his, he was kind of an unorthodox Muslim. His interest in local peoples included a lot of their magical and spiritual beliefs as well. And it's through this where he introduces Gardner to more of these magical and spiritual beliefs. And Gardner takes a particular interest in the kris, which is a ritual knife used for magical purposes, which we later see show up when he creates the religion of Wicca. It shows up in a lot of the ceremonies. And that's what I'm getting at in this kind of biographical segment. A lot of this stuff is laying the foundations of what would come later when he creates this religion. So by the time he's about 30 years old, about 1914, everything's looking pretty good for Gardner. He has this plantation, he has somewhat of a steady career, he's making friends with the locals, and he's still just gaining all that knowledge. But in 1914, World War I breaks out. And as a result of this, in 1915, Gardner, he joins a local volunteer militia known as the Malay States Volunteers Rifles. But way out here in Malaysia, he doesn't really see any action because the war is mostly raging in Europe. Apart from the Singapore Mutiny, which was this mutiny by some Islamic Indian regiments that were stationed in Singapore at the time who really didn't want to go to the Ottoman Empire to fight their brothers in Islam, nothing's really happening in this area of the world when it comes to World War I on the whole. But being a loyal British subject, he wants to do his part in the war effort. So in 1916, he returns to Britain and he tries to join the British Navy, but due to ill health, this asthma issue he's had his whole life, the Navy basically rejects him. So he ends up opting for a civilian job in the Voluntary Aid Detachment. This was basically a detachment of nurses and medical personnel who would work in field hospitals and in recuperation hospitals back in England. It was basically a civilian corps of people who either couldn't fight or didn't want to fight, but still wanted to contribute to the war effort. And it's through the VAD where he's sent to his post, which is basically on the outskirts of Liverpool. And he's essentially dealing with casualties who are coming back from the Battle of the Somme, and he's mostly tasked with changing wound dressings and looking after patients. But his stint there doesn't last long because he has this recurring case of malaria that he picked up during his years in Ceylon. And when it came back, he couldn't really perform his duties anymore, so he left to go back to his plantations in Malaysia. After this, he continues to run his plantation company up until about 1921. Around 1921, the commodity prices have dropped, so it wasn't really making a profit anymore. And that other rubber company that he had been working for essentially just sacks him, probably because they're not making a lot of profit anymore either. But in 1923, he lands on his feet because he finds work with the Office of Customs, and he becomes a government inspector of rubber plantations. So now he's allowed to basically travel around at his own leisure and just inspect these rubber plantations and submit a report, and hey, that's an easy job. I'd take it if I could get it. And it said that he immensely enjoyed this because now he could be out in nature, he could carouse with the locals, and he can indulge in this amateur anthropology that he's always interested in. And of course, after a couple years of doing this, after an illness, he's reassigned and promoted to a government inspector of rubber shops. He's essentially overseeing the regulation and sale of rubber in the country. And in 1926, he's put in charge of monitoring shops that are selling opium, because at the time, opium was becoming regulated as a controlled substance, and there were a lot of irregularities and illegal trade and black market shenanigans going on with this drug. However, Gardner had this belief that opium was essentially harmless, and it's believed, it's not confirmed, but it was believed that he would take a lot of bribes in this position to kind of look the other way. And that's how he was able to amass a small fortune, which would lead to his retirement. So later in 1927, his father becomes ill with what we know today as dementia. And while visiting his father, he's visiting all these spiritualist mediums and going to these spiritualist churches. And while he was very critical of what he saw because he did interact with a lot of frauds who were rampant during this second wave of spiritualism, he did admit that he had many genuine encounters, and this made him a true believer of spiritualism. And it was during this time in England where he meets his wife, a woman named Dorothea, also known as Donna. They marry very quickly within a month after they meet, and then they move back to Malaya, specifically in Johor Bahru, which is a state capital city, one of the states in Malaysia. And it's here where he once again becomes involved in Freemasonry. However, he kind of retires from it by April 1931. Probably because, just like before, it wasn't really giving him that wisdom or that knowledge that he was seeking. But this was the time where he really ramps up his interest in local anthropology. And he develops this deep interest of the local indigenous customs and takes a particular interest in folk magic and their weapons. And through this, he also becomes involved in the local archaeology. And at the time, the Sultan of the area really looked down on archaeology. He saw them as nothing more than grave robbers. So Gardner had to do these archaeological digs in secret. But it's through these archaeological exploits where he makes a lot of discoveries. He uncovers like 4 miles of earthworks. He also discovers various tombs and pottery and even porcelain dating from Ming China, which in itself is important because it would have shown trade between these indigenous people and the Ming dynasty at the time. He does further excavations at the cemetery of Kota Tinggi and the jungle city of Siong Penang. And through this, he discovers a lot of beads and coins. And these beads and coins suggested that there was trade going on between Malaysia and the Roman Empire, most likely through India. Because, it wasn't direct, these items would get traded across these trade routes. But it suggests this large network of trade that's going on. And Gardner would go on to publish academic papers on these beads and these coins. And some of the stuff he excavated is still on display at the National Museum of Singapore to this day. It's displayed in an exhibit on the early history of Johor. And at this point in his life, the 1930s, he's basically an anthropologist, archaeologist, folklorist. He's essentially in this whole new phase in life where that becomes the thing he focuses on the most. Throughout the early 30s, he's involved in excavations in Palestine. He's also involved in excavations at Devon in England. And he's getting acquainted with all the experts in the fields of archaeology and anthropology. Because it's that old joke when it comes to these sciences, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Because who you know is going to introduce you to other people who can get you into those conferences and on those sites and etc., etc. It's kind of how that world works. But during this time, his main bulk of research stays with the Malay people, and he's mainly interested in this ceremonial blade that they use known as the kris. And this kris blade has various magico-religious uses in this culture. It later does get adopted into Wiccan practices. And he collects like 400 examples of this blade, and he writes a book, and the book is actually very well received. And for those with any interest in that, it's literally called Kris and Other Melee Weapons. But in 1936, his life changes again, because in 1935 he hears that his father has died and left him about 3,000 pounds. And this is the time when he decides to finally retire from his day job in the Malaysian Civil Services. He's still kind of doing that as his day job in the background. They agree to let him retire a little early, and then he and his wife move back to England, specifically to the area around Devon. And it's finally at this point in his life where he really starts to lay the early foundations of Wicca. And to be honest, this is a part of his life that most other people will focus on, and I think that's doing him a disservice because everything that's led up to this point is very important in those foundations. Because it's not like he just woke up one day and became a witch. It didn't happen like that. Everything he was doing was built upon a long foundation of his interests in the occult and spiritualism and magical practices in the Far East. It was built on a foundation of anthropology and archaeology. This was a very intelligent and curious man. He didn't just fly into it and write the Book of Shadows out of nowhere, as a lot of people tend to suggest. So let's get into this part of his life. So in 1936, Gardner and his wife return to England and they're going to live out their retirement. However, as always, the English climate wasn't really great for his health. And to be honest, I don't see how the English climate is great for anyone's health. It's cold, it's wet. They consider a sunny day what we would consider an overcast day here in the United States, but I digress. But essentially, this climate is not great for his health, and upon becoming sick, he meets with this doctor by the name of Edward Gregg. And Dr. Gregg suggests that he try nudism, because at the time, nudism was believed to have certain health benefits. I don't know, maybe not wearing clothes gives you more vitamin D, but how do you get vitamin D in England where there's literally no sun? I digress. Now, at first, Gardner's very hesitant of this, but then he eventually visits this indoor nudist club, and he had felt that this had benefited his health in some way. Maybe it was a placebo effect, but I don't know. So that summer, he starts to frequent this outdoor nudist club in Hertfordshire, and he starts to make a bunch of friends, and he takes to the lifestyle. He then takes up this habit of traveling during the winter time, so in 1936, he travels to Cyprus, and he's studying Bronze Age swords, and he actually writes a paper on Bronze Age swords. And he takes an interest in Cyprus. He believes that he had once lived there in a previous life. And he actually bought a little plot of land there that I guess he was planning on building a cottage, but nothing ever came of it. And in 1937, he applied for and received a doctorate of philosophy from Meta Collegiate Extension of the National Electronic Institute. And this was based in Nevada, and it was stated that it was kind of like, remember Trump University? or those other for-profit universities where you basically just send them a fee and you get a degree, but it's not accredited at all. This was pretty much the same thing, except instead of doing online classes, you do it all through the mail. But he gets this degree, and from then on, he refers to himself as Dr. Gardner, despite the fact that other academic institutions wouldn't recognize these qualifications. But he's like, you know what, screw you, I got a degree. I'm Dr. Gardner now. But to be honest, I'm surprised he was never given like an honorary doctorate from one of these other colleges, like in England, Oxford, Cambridge, whatever, just due to the fact that he contributed so much to the science of anthropology and archaeology at the time. But I digress. After this, in 1938, he comes across this order. They're known as the Rosicrucian Order. How he becomes affiliated with this order is purely by chance. So he's walking down the street one day and he sees a theater, and the theater describes itself as the first Rosicrucian theater in England. Now, Rosicrucianism is a magical religious tradition within Western esotericism. They basically believe that there are magical or esoteric teachings within Western Christianity. That's the bare basics without going deep into it kind of explanation. So Gardner visits this theater a couple times, he takes an interest in it, and he becomes part of the group. And this group was a lot like those other esoteric kind of groups which were running around England in the late 1890s through the 1930s. Most famously, like I said, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but there were others as well. And this group was kind of a blend of Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, and Freemasonry. It was founded in 1920 by this guy named George Alexander Sullivan. And he made these wild claims that he was immortal, that he was the resurrection of all these historical figures like Pythagoras and Francis Bacon. But Gardner kind of saw through all the BS of this group. He's basically like, these guys are amateurs, they're idiots, they don't know what they're talking about. But it's along with some other group members where he's introduced to the Folklore Society. Now, this society does exactly what you think it does. It studied traditional English folklore. So all the cultural practices and beliefs and customs, which have been handed down throughout English history going way back to the Stone Age, that's what they're interested in. It's like myself, where I want to discover the origins of all of this stuff. They're doing the same thing. And this is a charitable society. It still exists to this very day, and they take a keen interest in the history and archaeology of these subjects. And Gardner joins this society and contributes to its publications because it's really in line with what he's been searching for his whole life. And his first contribution to their journal, Folklore, described a box of witchcraft relics which allegedly belonged to the 17th century witchfinder general, Matthew Hopkins, who I really need to do an episode on. He's a fascinating character, mostly because he was just batshit crazy, but I digress. During this time, he also writes a fictional book. It comes out in 1939 called A Goddess Arrives, and it was received as a very competent first work of fiction. So he's doing all these various things and meeting with all these various groups, and that's when he becomes involved with the New Forest Coven. And these guys would go on to really be the precursors to what Wicca becomes after Gardner. And in fact, these people would become instrumental in the creation of Wicca. So now we have to really deep dive into the New Forest Coven. And I know at this point it's a lot. I just gave you a big long biography of Gardner's life up until this point, and now I'm talking about this witches' coven, but it's all foundational to the religion. Because if you're going to understand where these ideas came from, you really have to understand the backstory. So, the New Forest Coven. So they were literally a group of pagan witches who would meet around the area of New Forest in southern England during the early 20th century. And they believed in the continuous survival of this ancient English witch cult, which, to be honest, has largely been debunked when you look at the history. I won't really go deep into that here, but the gist is, during the Christianization of England, there was these groups of basically witches who retained the old practices and the old ways and handed them down throughout the generations. Like I said, it's largely been debunked. because regardless of Christianization, English folklore has always been handed down over the generations. If you want to read more of that and get really into the weeds, you can always look it up. Just go to Wikipedia and type in witch cult hypothesis and have a blast. But at the time, the people of the New Forest Coven believed in this supposed pre-Christian pagan religion, and they worshipped a horned god and a triple goddess, which was apparently the god and goddess of this pagan religion. And these deities would show up later in Gardnerian Wicca. And as always, in the 20th century, that idea kind of grew out of these new esoteric movements that were going on in Europe at the time. I sound like a broken record, but Rosicrucianism, Golden Dawn, Thelema, etc., etc. And they were basically combining these English folklore traditions with Masonic traditions, or more specifically, co-Masonic traditions, because co-Masonic traditions include both females and males. But generally by the 1930s, they have formed into kind of a coven of witches who were in this area. And this coven of witches become affiliated with Gardner in September 1939. Now, it's possible he already knew these people from his interactions and travels with these other groups. But according to Gardner himself, one night in September 1939, members of this coven appeared at his house. They revealed to him that they were part of this coven, and they initiated him into it. This event would change Gardner's life forever, because from this point on, he is a practicing witch. However, Wicca doesn't exist yet. All of these ideas and beliefs and rituals, they haven't really come together yet and congealed into a solid doctrine or a religion. But luckily, Gardner would take up that challenge, and using his experiences, he would start to define the earliest foundations of Gardnerian Wicca. And the one big claim to fame that everybody talks about from this coven is Operation Cone of Power, which takes place in 1940. Now, in 1940, we are at the beginnings of World War II. Poland has been invaded. The Battle of France had led to the German occupation of that nation and the divide between Vichy France and essentially Free France. And as far back as 1939, everybody in Britain knew that the Germans were going to attempt to invade the island nation. And Gardner and his coven believed that this magical ritual could dissuade the Nazi high command from invading Britain. And real quick, I'm just going to briefly explain what a cone of power is. It's literally a cone of energy that is generated by the group members as they're standing in this ritualistic circle. And as the ritual reaches its crescendo, they can direct this cone of energy towards whatever the goal is. And how that looks in practice is basically this. So Gardner, along with some of his fellow witches, they go out into the New Forest and they create this huge bonfire. And it's probably good that they created this fire, because this was a damp, cold night and you needed that fire to keep you warm. So it's also practical. So around this bonfire, they cast a circle, and this circle is meant to protect the group as they're doing this ritual. And as they're standing in this circle, they'll perform various rituals, ritual gestures. Some covens, they drum. Some covens, they will pray. Sometimes they'll chant and dance around in a circle. This is what's believed to have happened when Gardner did this cone of power. And in Gardner's case and his fellow coven's case, they were doing this in the nude. They were dancing and chanting around this fire as they were building up this energy. And as it reached a crescendo, they directed that energy towards the Nazi leadership and put in their brains, "You will not cross the English Channel." And to be honest, with the exception of the aerial battles, let's just say there was never a land invasion. However, it wasn't all great for some of the members. It stated that at least 2 of the older members died of pneumonia after this ritual. And that's actually corroborated with the historical accounts. You can literally go look them up. Their names were Walter Forder. He was a blacksmith who died shortly after this ritual. And another local man named Charles Loader, who also died shortly after this ritual. Both men were thought to have been part of this coven. And I would argue that this is the first time we really see a Wiccan religious practice take place. It's where all the pieces finally come together and they start really piecing together the religion, or at least the foundation of the religion. And to be honest, during these very early years where the religion was really getting its start, this was the only ritual that Gardner ever really came out and explained, because remember, this is the 1930s, 1940s. And at this time in Britain, it was still technically illegal to be a witch. Those witchcraft acts, or whatever they were still technically in effect. So the first 10 years or so, this is all very secretive. It's not like today where you can just walk down the street and say, hey, look at me, I'm a witch. This is still old school, conservative, Christian England. Now, in World War II, he was obviously too old to go and fight, so he joins what's known as the Air Raid Warden Service. And it's basically the civilian wing of mostly older men who want to do their part for their country. And they were tasked with things like enforcing the blackouts and manning the air raid sirens. And to be honest, we really don't know a whole lot of what Gardner was doing during World War II outside of this, but what I believe is he's probably really diving into kind of codifying Wicca into a religion. I believe this is the time where he really starts working on the Book of Shadows. And he's still affiliating with this same New Forest Coven, because at this time they really are the core, that spark point of what the religion will eventually become. But what we do know is in 1945, shortly after the war, he's in London. He kept a flat, or an apartment there, and he would occasionally visit the Spitalplatz Nudist Club, of which he was a member. At this time, the dude's been basically living the nudist lifestyle for like half a decade, so of course he's a member there. And it's here where he meets a man named Ross Nichols, and he introduces Nichols to Druidry, the quote ancient pagan religion of the Druids, and this leads to the formation of the Bricket Wood Coven, which is believed to be the first coven in the Gardnerian line of Wicca. And part of the formation of this coven was the fact that he didn't want Wicca to die with him. He had this fear that if he died, then his religion at this point would die. So he, along with other members, create this coven so it can live on after his death and these teachings can live on. So at this point, Gardner's looking to kind of build a legacy, and he builds it through this new coven. It's also not long after this point in 1947 where Gardner is introduced to Aleister Crowley, and Crowley inducts him as a member of the 4th degree of the OTO. And if you want to hear more about Aleister Crowley, I have a whole biography about him. It's the season opener. And it's kind of amazing that the founders of two different religions meet during this time in history. Crowley is essentially the father of the religion of Thelema, and Gardner is essentially the father of Wicca. And I imagine the two probably had long discussions and shared their knowledge across the esoteric and the occult. And this was less than a year before Crowley's death. In fact, towards the end of 1947, Gardner and his wife, they're touring the United States. He meets with some family in North Carolina, and he decides to go to New Orleans because he wants to learn about voodoo practices. And on a side note, I have been trying to work on an episode about voodoo practices for over a year now, and it's just not really coming together. Ever since I did that episode about zombies and voodoo culture, I've been inundated with many requests to do kind of a deeper dive into that religion. But it's extremely complex, and to be honest, I have no idea where to start, but I digress. So Gardner's touring America, and during this time, Aleister Crowley dies, and this effectively makes Gardner kind of the leader of the OTO, Crowley's order, in Europe. And apparently there are these questions over the next couple of years of who should lead the OTO. Howard Gardner, he's not really interested in it. So by 1951, he kind of just steps aside and away from the whole thing. And another person, a man by the name of Frederick Milliner, he becomes the OTO's head European representative. Also during this time, 1949-ish, he publishes another book. It's called High Magic's Aid. And while it's presented as a work of fiction, he basically gives you step-by-step information of a lot of Wiccan rituals. And to be honest, this book did very well. It actually did so well, it managed to get a second print run. And of course, privately, he's working on his own scrapbook where he's writing down all these Wiccan rituals and all this ceremonial magic, and that becomes the prototype for the Book of Shadows. And the way Gardner described the Book of Shadows when he presented it to the Bricketwood Coven was this was his personal cookbook for his rituals and his magic. And it's literally an account of everything he's doing as he's doing it. And this was all handwritten by Gardner himself, and it takes inspiration from everything Gardner has learned up to this point. There's stuff from Freemasonry, there's stuff from his time in the Far East. There were also rituals from Crowley and the OTO, and there were rituals that he kind of just created himself by combining various different things. And if you actually look at the original manuscript, you could see where he's kind of working out all the details, and, you know, he might cross something out and change something here or there. But good luck getting a real look at that original manuscript. It's held in a bank vault in Spain. It's in a private collection. But I believe there are copies out there online. I'm sure there are. Of course, by 1953, this follower of his, a woman named Doreen, she suggests to Gardner that he kind of get rid of all the Crowley influence in the Book of Shadows, probably because Crowley was really big into dark magic. And Gardner's like, well, if you think you can do it better, go for it. So she revises it, and that becomes the Book of Shadows as we know it today. And Doreen becomes the high priestess of this coven. However, it wasn't until long after Gardner's death when this book was published. And in 1984, large portions of Gardner's works were published in a book called The Witch's Way. Now, a lot of people think that this Book of Shadows is kind of like a doctrine or a biblical text, and it's really nothing like that. From what I understand, every witch and every coven usually has its own kind of Book of Shadows. There's usually one for the coven that kind of shows like their core spells and beliefs and whatnot. And then usually each witch has their own, which not only includes these core values, but a list of spells and rituals that have worked for them personally, because at the end of the day, Wicca is a very personal religion. And that's kind of why there's several different branches. It's just Gardnerian Wicca is kind of that origin point, that spark point. And even Gardner says it himself to the followers of his coven, quote, "The Book of Shadows is not a Bible or Quran. It is a personal cookbook of spells that have worked for the owner. I am giving you my copy to get you started. As you gain experience, discard these spells that don't work for you and substitute those that you have thought of yourselves." End quote. He's essentially saying, this is the foundation and this is what has worked for me. Take it as a starting point and then build off of that. And this kind of explains why Wicca is very loosely organized. It goes from coven to coven. It's hyper-individualized. While there are some things that create a core, it's up for the user, it's up for the witch to see how it works in their lives and with their lives. Of course, there are certain symbols and rituals and beliefs that are kind of common across all Wiccan users. For example, the pentacle. Most Wiccans often understand that the pentacle's 5 points represent each of the 5 elements of earth, air, fire, water, and the ether or the spirit. It's also at the same time regarded as the symbol of the human, with the points representing the head, legs, and arms. Now, in Gardnerian Wicca, or what's known today as BTW, British Traditional Wicca, that was duotheistic, so they believed in a horned god and a triple goddess. And these are believed to be ancient pagan deities from that, quote, witch cult from way back in the day. And a lot of adherents to traditional Gardnerian Wicca still kind of agree with that kind of idea. Of course, other branches of Wicca have broken off, and some of them are polytheistic, some are monotheistic, Some of them are goddess monotheistics, where they worship a goddess, usually the moon goddess, or a moon goddess. Generally, the phases of the moon are very important in these Gardnerian Wiccan rituals. This kind of goes back to that idea of the triple goddess. But there are even agnostics in Wicca. Usually they see the depictions of the gods and goddesses as symbolic as opposed to literal. And especially here in the United States where it's hyper-individualized, there are a lot of what are known as soul practitioners, so they're doing it by themselves in the privacy of their own home. And they can craft their beliefs to whatever they want. And to be honest, a lot of covens are very small, especially here in the United States. Some covens only consist of 3 or 4 people, but most covens out there typically contain anywhere from 5 to 10 people. This isn't a religion like Christianity where it's get as many butts in the seats as possible. They don't care about that kind of growth, mostly because they're not after money, which all Christian religions are. And I can get really out there in the weeds about the traditions and practices and rituals and all that fun stuff, but that's not really the goal of this episode. I'm really looking just to tell the story of Gardner because he was the one who really gave the world Wicca in its modern form, at least in his tradition. So in this last segment, let's discuss how he did that, because that is the whole goal of the end part of his life. So in 1951, Gardner moves to the island of Man, and with this partner, a man named Cecil Williamson, they opened the Folklore Center of Superstition and Witchcraft. It's a witchcraft museum. However, this museum's not really a financial success, and by 1954, the partnership ends. And Gardner buys out Williamson's half, and he relocates it to England, and it becomes the Museum of Witchcraft, nowadays known as the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. And it has several exhibits dedicated to folk magic, ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, and today Wicca. And to be honest, Gardner runs this museum up until his death. Also in 1954, Gardner publishes a nonfiction book, which becomes probably his most famous and widely regarded book, Witchcraft Today. And this book largely recounts Gardner's thoughts on the history and practices of this theoretical witch cult that he believed in. It also deals with some other theories that he had. He believed that the Knights Templar had practiced this religion. And he talks about his belief in fairies, and he believes that fairies in the medieval times were an ancient race of secretive pygmy people that were living in England. But despite those more outlandish theories, this does become a foundational text in the religion of Wicca. Of course, after the publication of this book, he's kind of out as a witch. It's no longer a secretive little thing that you do in the privacy of your own home. He's telling the world, hey, I'm a witch, this is what I believe in. And this being conservative 1950s London, he's met with a lot of backlash, especially from the press. They accuse him and his followers of devil worship. They accuse him of whitewashing witchcraft history in order to lure people into covens. They attack him for his views on nudism. But Gardner didn't back down because he believed that through his publicity, his religion would grow and live on beyond his death. Gardner never had the sense that he was the so-called founder of a religion. He believed that he was just the latest in a line of a religion going all the way back to the Stone Age, going back through this witch cult hypothesis. It's really after his death when people attribute him to as the founder of this religion. Hell, Wicca wasn't even what he called his religion. That wasn't really attributed to him till years later. Most of the time he referred to it simply as witchcraft or the craft. Although he did state that during that initial initiation ceremony when he was first initiated into the New Forest Coven, on that night he heard the word Wicca, which I guess he thought simply meant witch. But it really doesn't get attributed to him or his religion until years later. After this, in the 50s, Gardner would make television appearances, and he would defend himself against the rumors that he was doing this for orgiastic purposes, or that he was a devil worshiper or whatever. And he's really educating the public on what a witch is at this time. because the public doesn't know that this is a religion based on things like respecting your place in nature and performing healing rituals and etc., etc. The general public basically just thinks it's orgiastic devil worship. So Gardner essentially sets out to really debunk that stuff. And during this time, his religion starts to see an uptick in growth. And in 1959, Gardner releases his final book. It's a nonfiction book called The Meaning of Witchcraft. And this book really is the one that finally brings everything together. It's a discussion of the history and his beliefs and the signs and symbols and rituals and all of this stuff. It's all finally come together in this final book. And this book is a hit. I mean, it's still in publication today, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, at this point, Gardner's in the final few years of his wife. In 1960, his wife Donna, she passes away. And after this, he's suffering from more asthma attacks, so he decides to travel. He travels to the island of Mallorca in the Mediterranean Sea. I'm sure he was fascinated by some of the ancient prehistoric settlements there. And in 1963, he decides to travel to Lebanon for the winter, possibly to do an archaeological dig or something like that. And during his return journey on 12 February 1964 aboard the ship, the Scottish Prince, he would suffer a fatal heart attack during breakfast. He was buried in Tunisia, which was the ship's next port of call, and only the captain was there to attend his funeral. Several years after his death, a Wiccan high priestess known as Eleanor Bourne visited Tunisia in order to find Gardner's grave. And when she discovered that the cemetery he was interred in was to be redeveloped, she raised money and had his body relocated to a cemetery in Tunis, where it remains to this very day. And as of 2007, there's a plaque on that grave describing him as the father of modern Wicca, because his life's work and his legacy really led to the formation of Wicca as a religion. It was no longer this secretive coven in the south of England of 12 people or whatever. It's now a major world religion, even to the point where entities like the United States military, for example, recognizes it as a formal religion. If you're in the army and you want to practice Wicca, you are perfectly welcome to. Now, I do know that in this episode, I didn't discuss much of the craft itself because, to be honest, it is extremely complex. And as I said, that's not really what this episode was supposed to be about. It was really supposed to be about Gardner, the father of modern Wicca, when it comes to Gardenian Wicca, I guess. Because there are other branches, however, a lot of those branches came later after Gardner's time. But no matter what branch you subscribe to, or even if you don't subscribe to a branch and you're just a self-practitioner, it all kind of has that core start point with the works of Gardner and his coven. And to be honest, that's really all I have for you today. I really just wanted to discuss Gardner and his beliefs and how his beliefs led to the foundations of this religion, because I believe it's a very fascinating story. And I feel it's a story that really doesn't get told. Generally, the story doesn't really start until he's in his 50s, after he's initiated into the new Forest Coven and becomes kind of a celebrity. But tell me what you think. What do you think of Charles Gardner? What do you think of his life's work? As always, I encourage you to reach out to me, let me know. You can find me on the socials. It's Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram or at Threads. There's also a YouTube channel where these episodes get re-uploaded. And as always, our primary home is on Spotify. But if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or one of the other 5,000 podcast platforms out there, I've completely lost track of how many platforms this show is on. Feel free to give it those 5 stars, give it that thumbs up or whatever. Leave a comment. You can always support the podcast monetarily by clicking that link in the description of every episode. That really helps out a lot. And continue spreading the word, because as always, word of mouth is truly how this podcast has spread. That's why it's in 62 countries right now and in all 50 states. And on that note, once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.